Ukrainian forces say they are still fiercely defending the eastern city of Bakhmut, despite Russian claims that the city is surrounded. Now, capturing Bakhmut would give Putin's army the ability to launch aerial attacks further into Ukraine and would symbolize some military progress for the Russians. CNN's Melissa Bell is in Ukraine, where officials are worried thousands of civilians remain trapped in the city under siege.
What?
Bakhmut still stands, says the Ukrainian military, but only just.
Looks really hellish.
The bridge along the last possible supply route in and out destroyed overnight, leaving out of reach and nearly encircled around 4,500 civilians, including 48 children. The ghosts of Bakhmut, entirely out of sight, any sign of life driven underground.
What is life like then in Bakhmut today for the civilians, for the soldiers?
What life? What life? You know, the soldiers are doing their work, which is quite hard, and civilians are trying to survive. There is no water, there is no electricity.
This was Bakhmut in August when the siege had just begun. This is Bakhmut 7 months on. The city is empty. People are afraid to go out. Every day, new destruction. It's better not to go outside, writes Dr. Elena Molchanova from inside the town. CNN met her and other nurses on Christmas Eve. Not quite happier times, but certainly less desperate ones. Now the constant artillery prevents her from leaving the basement of her hospital. The Ukrainian military says civilians are now trapped. The head of the Wagner mercenary group urging Ukrainians nonetheless to try to leave Bakhmut as his men close in.
The pincers are tightening. The Ukrainian soldiers are fighting, but their lives near Bakhmut are short, a day or two. Give them a chance to leave the city. It is, in fact, surrounded.
Ukraine dismissing those comments as a disinformation campaign designed to spread panic. For now, Ukrainian soldiers continue to fight.
Almost all the outskirts ruined absolutely. Almost every house has these holes and have these marks of shelling. The streets are empty. The picture is quite sad.
But inside, life, as best it can, goes on. Elena helping those who come with what drugs are left, and she sends us this. Spring is coming, she says, even to Bakhmut, and that means there's hope.
Pamela, those spring-like conditions had been expected to slow the Russian advance, the muddy and collapsed trenches, the flooded fields. In fact, the sheer number of Russian soldiers and mercenaries that have been thrown at Bakhmut have meant that the city will surely fall. It's a matter of time. And in fact, the next dreaded stage has begun, which is the pounding of the next village to the west, Chaziv Yar. But surely that question of the fate of those 4,500 civilians will have to be part of the calculation longer term about whether or not this 7-month-long fight was worth the cost, Pamela.
Melissa Bell, thank you very much. And joining us now is Amanda Sloat. She is the Senior Director for Europe on the National Security Council. So, Amanda, we just heard about Russia's siege on Bakhmut. Could you give us an honest assessment of what is actually happening on the ground in Ukraine? Does it look like Russian forces are, in fact, gaining steam?
So it's hard for me here standing in Washington to give you a better assessment than what the Ukrainians featured in your interview are seeing on the ground. Certainly it has been a bloody and vicious fight. The Russians have heavily invested in this for unclear reasons because it's not of particular strategic value for them. We have seen them throwing thousands of bodies at this fight, including a large number of prisoners, and it's not going to be something that's replicable for them. So from here, we're continuing to give the Ukrainians the security assistance they need, including another large package that we announced today to enable them to continue fighting effectively on the battlefield.
What is the significance of Bakhmut, and what kind of morale blow would it be to the Ukrainians if they lose it?
The Ukrainians so far have taken back already half of the territory seized by Russia since this war began. The strategic value for Russia has never been particularly clear.
I want to talk about the meeting today between President Biden and Chancellor Scholz. One administration official told CNN that they could discuss intelligence showing China is considering giving Russia lethal aid. Is that aid imminent?
Sorry, you broke up. Can you repeat?
Yeah, that's okay. So we have reporting that Chancellor Scholz and President Biden were expected to discuss the intelligence showing China is considering giving Russia lethal aid. Is that aid imminent?
So far, we have not seen evidence that China is providing military support to Russia. It is something that we are continuing to watch. It's something that we have been very clear with China there would be consequences of. But thus far, we have not seen evidence that China has made that decision and gone forward. Certainly, if they did, it would be very damaging to what China is trying to do, both in Europe and internationally.
Has the administration seen any evidence or intelligence that China may be reconsidering that consideration to provide lethal aid to Russia?
So as we have indicated previously, we had evidence that China was considering it, but for now we have not seen evidence that China has actually made a decision to move forward.
All right. So despite being excluded from today's aid package, Ukraine's defense minister said that he is confident Western countries will in fact send those fighter jets to Ukraine. Is he right? What do you say to him?
So President Biden has spoken to the question of F-16s. Right now, we are focused on ensuring that Ukraine has the security assistance that it needs for prosecuting the battle on the ground. Today, we announced another significant security assistance package that included large amounts of ammunition and other types of equipment that the Ukrainians have been using very effectively in their fight.
And no doubt the administration, the country has given weapons that Ukraine has been asking for. But specifically as it relates to F-16s, has that definitively been taken off the table as part of any future aid package to Ukraine?
So President Biden has spoken pretty clearly about this in terms of where his view is now. We are continuing to work in lockstep with our Ukrainian partners. Chancellor Scholz here today, the president and Chancellor Scholz several weeks ago made an announcement about the decision to provide tanks, continuing to provide security assistance, including the package that we announced around the anniversary with another package today. And what we are focused on right now is ensuring that Ukraine has the equipment that they need for the fight that they are currently engaged in.
Right. And I understand what you're saying about the president saying where things stand now as it relates to F-16s. But what about future aid packages? Has it been taken off the table for that as well?
Here are the issues. China urged peace after a U.S. warning of serious consequences if it provided arms to support Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Washington and its NATO allies are scrambling to dissuade China from providing military aid to Moscow's war. In a surprise visit to Kyiv, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to reaffirm U.S. economic support and to announce the recent transfer of $1.25 billion in assistance. The U.S. and its allies are moving to treat Iran as a global threat, warning its growing alliance with Russia and cooperation in Ukraine means Tehran's destabilizing activities will pose a greater danger than ever before. The Supreme Court's conservative justices cast doubt on President Biden's debt forgiveness plan during oral arguments, hindering the administration's plan to wipe out more than $400 billion in student debt because of the emergency economic change of the coronavirus pandemic. Jill Biden returned from her visit to Africa as the U.S. First Lady. President Biden said she, quote, spoke to more than 1,000 young people, the first generation born out of apartheid in Namibia. In Kenya, she met families affected by devastating drought and food insecurity, made worse by Putin's brutal assault on Ukraine, and made it clear that America's commitment to Africa is real. That's from President Biden. And Afghanistan's government's watchdog for reconstruction revealed that the U.S. helped lay the groundwork for the quick fall of the country when U.S. troops left Afghanistan in August 2021. Well, those are the issues, and let's get started. Well, a year after Russia's invasion and bombing of Ukraine, China, Moscow's strategic partner, has taken a rare initiative into European problem solving by offering a 12-point position paper to end the conflict in Ukraine. What is the U.S. and its allies, what are they making of this from China?
President Biden is certainly saying that this is not a plan that's considered seriously. I think he was asked in an interview recently what he thought about the peace plan, and he said there's nothing in there that would benefit anybody other than Russia. So the White House is not considering this as a serious proposal. They are very much concerned in terms of the ties that appear to be growing closer between Beijing and Moscow. We know that there are rumors of a planned meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Putin as early as next week. We still haven't had that confirmation yet. But this is certainly a relationship that the West is paying attention very closely. This is something as well that the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz urged China not to send weapons to help Russia's war in Ukraine and instead ask Beijing to pressure Moscow to pull back its forces. So this is the same kind of message that the White House is trying to send out to China. This is another one of those, if you're helping Russia, then you're part of the problem instead of part of the solution, that kind of messaging that's coming out from the West.
China's peace plan was not rejected in whole by President Zelensky. He remarked that there are some things in the Chinese plan that made sense, but for the most part, it seems like the China peace plan is somewhat dead on arrival. Even Russia seems to have some issue with it. A Kremlin spokesman saying, for now, we don't see any of the conditions that are needed to bring the whole story toward peace. So while China it seems to want to play peacemaker, as Patsy said, the United States sees this as something that is definitely tilting toward Russia and kind of rejected out of hand.
As Steve said, the rejection or kind of the cold shoulder from Russia is basically because the plan from Beijing does not recognize what they call new territorial realities in Ukraine. So it doesn't really mention what kind of settlement that the party should be working on. And I think this is key in terms of any kind of potential peace plan. And it just seems so far off into the future right now because of the issue of, just where do we draw the lines? Do we include borders from 2014, which would include Crimea being returned to Ukraine or not? I mean, obviously, Ukraine is saying that what we want is all of our territories, including Crimea. And this may be just the issue that does not get settled. In terms of the future of even a potential peace plan, it may have to look like some sort of ceasefire where these territorial disagreements are left aside, where the parties stop their conflict without settling the issue of who has what, and rather focus on, what kind of security guarantees does Ukraine receive from the West that would be acceptable to both Kyiv and Moscow. But again, this is very, very far off into the future. The White House has for many, many months now, maybe about 4 to 6 months, have stopped saying things like offering a diplomatic off-ramp to Putin, simply because they don't see at this point that Putin is looking for any kind of diplomatic off-ramp.
Also this week, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in India. What came out of this meeting?
Not a whole lot. It seems like it happened for about 10 minutes on the sidelines of the G20 ministerial meeting in Delhi. According to a State Department spokesman, Blinken stressed the need for a peaceful resolution of the war in Ukraine and a resolution that maintains territorial integrity. It's the first time that the two have spoken face to face in, it seems like, at least a year. They have spoken on the phone. There was a negotiation for the release of the U.S. basketball player, Brittany Griner, several months ago. So the two men have spoken, but certainly not for any length of time, and certainly not on anything that will result in something peaceful happening anytime soon.
The other 2 points that Blinken made to Lavrov was urging Russia to reverse its decision to pull out or to suspend participation in the New START nuclear treaty. This was something that happened just a few weeks ago. And, this is concerning, but the White House has been kind of dismissing it, saying that, well, they didn't pull out entirely, but they did stop participation. This is, of course, in response to the U.S. sending more weapons to Ukraine. The other point that Blinken requested or made to Lavrov was that Moscow should release Paul Whelan. This is the other American that has been detained in Moscow.
Yes, it's a really good point. And President Biden marked the start of a second year of war in Europe by announcing billions of dollars in additional military aid for Ukraine and imposing more sanctions on those helping President Putin, and delivered a grim warning about an alliance between Russia and Iran. So what are Iran's intentions?
Iran's intentions seem to be the same thing as Iran's intentions for many years, which is to disrupt the regular process of how countries work with one another, and certainly trying to supply Russia with the kind of weapons that really disrupt day-to-day life. These drones that appear somewhat out of nowhere and can travel long distances with light payloads to deliver kind of surprising and out of the blue type of strikes that are not necessarily seen by radar that is looking for missiles coming from Russia or other kind of weaponry that might be coming over the transom.
Yeah, and I think what's notable about the developments in terms of what Iran is doing with Russia is the U.S. characterization of it, right? So I think earlier this week, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Dana Stroul said that we are now at the point where Iran is threatening not just the Middle East, but has become a global challenge. Now, that's a shift because, as of just a few months ago, U.S. officials are still looking at Iran as a regional threat, a regional menace, rather than a global challenge. So this is a departure of language, a ramping up of language from U.S. officials, including CIA director who called the relationship between Iran and Russia disturbing and moving very quickly in a very dangerous direction. So we'll see what comes out of it, but there's definitely a lot more scrutiny on Iran from U.S. administration officials, even though Iran continues to deny that it provides drones to Russia.
Yes, and as you say, we will have to continue to follow developments on that. Well, it's time now for a quick break, and later, U.S. First Lady Jill Biden leaves Africa on warm notes. Issues in the News is coming to you from the Voice of America in Washington. If you would like to download the program, it's free on iTunes. Just click on the iTunes tab on our website at voanews.com/issues. While you're there, check out our other programs, Press Conference USA and Encounter. Also visit us on Facebook and leave a comment or two. Then like us at Current Affairs with Carol Castiel. Now back to our panel via Skype, VOA White House Bureau Chief Patsy Whitaker-Zwara and VOA Executive Producer Steve Reddish. Well, Steve, the U.S. Supreme Court, mostly conservative justices, posed the question during arguments over Biden's move to forgive $430 billion in student loan debt as an unlawful overreach of executive power. Is this something for Congress rather than the executive power of the president?
Chief Justice John Roberts raised that issue, whether it's right for President Biden and the executive branch to have so much power over so much money, since it's Congress's duty, constitutional duty, to decide how the money is spent. The Solicitor General, who argues on behalf of the White House in front of the Supreme Court, argued that Congress did indeed decide that question when it passed the HEROES Act back in 2003 that allowed the Education Secretary to have broad powers over lots of different money issues, including the power to forgive or to suspend payments for student loans. At the time, it was passed shortly after the 9/11 attacks. There was a lot of concern about Americans who were joining the military because of the 9/11 attacks, whether it was going to be a burden for these soldiers to pay back any student loans that they had. So Congress made this carve out in the HEROES Act that allowed the Secretary of Education to make these kind of decisions. So obviously it's a large amount of money. About 43.5 Americans have student loans, and that debt is more than $1.7 trillion. So the $400 billion in student loan debt that the Biden administration is trying to wipe out is probably about 25% of that. Maybe it's a little less than that of the $1.7 trillion in loans that have been taken out. The big issue here is the politics of it. Republicans have used the issue to cast the Democrats as elitist, favoring cancellation of student debt for higher educated Americans over those who either chose not to go to college or couldn't afford to go to college. President Biden, in his campaign in 2020 for the presidency, made a promise that he would do something about student debt. One of the results of that is that for the first time, more than half of the country's young people actually came out to vote in 2020. Whether it was because of student debt or not, the youth vote did come out. President Biden did win. And so he's trying to pay back that campaign promise that he made. Whether or not he succeeds, whether or not the Supreme Court makes this decision to overturn it or send it back to Congress or whatever, at least President Biden can say to these people that I promised, I came through, I tried. And I think that's the biggest issue in the court, other than the decision as to whether or not to go through with this. It's really about politics and appearances as far as President Biden trying to reach out and touch younger Americans where it matters most